Esoteric traditions have spent thousands of years telling us that the fundamental nature of reality is a war between opposites, but Joe Bandel's Oak Matrix Anchor 8 fundamentally shatters that paradigm. He proposes something completely counterintuitive for Western mysticism. What if the archetypal masculine and feminine forces aren't locked in an eternal back-to-back struggle, but are instead standing side by side, holding hands, facing the exact same direction inside a containing circle? This isn't just a minor tweak to the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. It is a complete rewrite of how we conceptualize duality, hierarchy, and power.
It really is a massive architectural shift. To understand what Bandel is doing with the Oak Matrix, and specifically Anchor 8, you have to look at the traditional Kabbalistic model. In classic Hermetic Kabbalah, the Tree of Life is built around pillars. You have the pillar of severity, which is traditionally associated with the feminine, form, and restriction. Then you have the pillar of mercy, associated with the masculine, force, and expansion. They share a central pillar, the pillar of mildness, which acts as the fulcrum. But the implicit imagery in a lot of esoteric thought is that the masculine and feminine archetypes stand back to back. They share a spine, so to speak, but they look in entirely different directions. They operate in different domains.
And that back-to-back imagery immediately implies a blind spot. If they are facing opposite directions, they can never actually see each other. They can never inhabit the exact same world or have a shared progressive vision. They are just counterbalancing weights on a scale.
Exactly. They are structural opposites. The tension between them keeps the universe from collapsing, but it is fundamentally a system of tension. Bandel looks at that and says, this model traps us in what he calls duality as conflict. In his work, particularly in his recent books like the OAK Matrix and the OAK Matrix Unleashed, he argues that humanity has been brainwashed by this duality as war thinking. It leads to toxic hierarchies where one side must eventually conquer or dominate the other. So Anchor 8 introduces the mirror circle Kabbalah.
Right, where instead of one tree with two opposing sides, we get two complete trees. They are standing side by side, holding hands.
Yes, two complete autonomous systems. They aren't having themselves to form a whole. They are whole on their own, but they choose to link up and face the same forward direction, and crucially, they are enclosed in a circle representing perpetual wholeness. Bandel calls this duality as a loving embrace. It changes the math of the esoteric universe from zero-sum competition to progressive elemental union.
I want to dig into Joe Bandel himself, because his background gives this a lot of context. He isn't just some modern wellness guru churning out positive affirmations. He has spent years translating highly obscure, often very dark early 20th century German literature.
He has. Bandel lives up in northern Minnesota, and he is a prolific translator of German esoteric fantasy and horror from the pre-World War I era. He's translated works by Hans-Heinz Ewers, Paul Busson, and Karl-Hans Strobel. He even translated Der Orchideengarten, which was published in 1919 and is widely considered the world's first illustrated fantasy magazine. This is a guy who has spent thousands of hours immersed in the Weimar-era occult, psychological horror, and highly complex Gnostic philosophies.
Which makes his pivot to duality as a loving embrace so fascinating. If you spend your career translating Hans-Heinz Ewers, a writer famous for tales of vampirism, homunculi, and deep psychological dread, you are intimately familiar with the concept of duality as a nightmare, the shadow self tearing the ego apart.
That is the perfect way to frame it, Lily. The German esoteric tradition that Bandel knows so well is often obsessed with the Faustian bargain, the agonizing split between flesh and spirit, between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It is the ultimate expression of the back-to-back archetype, where the conscious mind and the shadow are in a state of mutual disgust. Bandel takes all that dense, heavy, conflict-driven cosmology and actively transmutes it. He says, we don't have to live in that gothic horror story anymore. We can upgrade our spiritual software.
Let's push back on this a little bit. By replacing the single tree with two side-by-side trees holding hands, doesn't that risk smoothing over the necessary friction of existence? The traditional Tree of Life uses tension because life is tense. Chaos and order do fight. To say they are just holding hands in a loving embrace inside a circle, doesn't that sound a bit utopian? Does it lose the explanatory power of the older, harsher models?
It would be utopian if Bandel didn't have such a rigorous, almost punishing view of what this embrace requires. The oak matrix doesn't mean everything is easy. The metaphor he uses for growth in his system is an oak tree straining against severe winds. The bark of the oak physically cracks under the pressure, and that violent rupture is what releases the sap needed for new growth. He advocates for pushing oneself into states of extreme chaos through intense study or physical exertion to break astral barriers. So the two trees holding hands aren't skipping through a meadow. They are bracing each other against the storm.
So the union is forged in fire. They are facing the same direction because they are marching into the wind together rather than fighting each other.
Precisely. The traditional model drains energy because the left hand is constantly wrestling the right hand. Anchor 8 of the oak matrix resolves that internal civil war. Bandel integrates this with his theories on bioelectricity and sensory awareness. He argues that when you stop treating duality as a conflict, you stop leaking energy. You unify your internal masculine and feminine, your projective and receptive capacities, so that all your energy flows forward.
It's a shift from a static structure to a kinetic one. The back-to-back archetypes are stuck in place, holding up the roof of the universe. The side-by-side trees are progressive. They are moving.
They are moving towards self-actualization. Bandel's entire philosophy, which he sometimes calls organic Gnosticism, is about personal empowerment. He rejects the old Gnostic idea that the physical world is a prison or an evil illusion. In traditional texts like the Sefer Bahir, you see the beginnings of complex gendered divine forces, but also the lingering idea of the physical world as something to escape. Bandel flips that. The physical world, the body, the ego, these are sacred. The embrace of spirit and matter is the goal.
Which brings us back to the containing circle. In sacred geometry, the circle represents infinity, containment, and protection. By placing the two trees inside the circle, it creates a closed thermodynamic system. The energy doesn't dissipate into the void.
Yes, and it also establishes a boundary. In his writings, Bandel talks a lot about attention and energy. He says, where your attention goes, your energy flows. The circle represents conscious conservation. It keeps out the manipulative pulls of modern society, commercials, toxic beliefs, artificial conflicts. It creates a safe container for these two massive archetypal forces to operate together without being drained by external static.
It's interesting how he uses the term matrix as well. We usually think of a matrix as a trap, thanks to the movies, but originally it means a womb or a molding environment. The oak matrix is a generative space. But Daniel, I have to ask about how this applies practically. It's a beautiful geometric visualization, but how does an individual listener actually use Anchor 8?
Practically, it is an auditing tool for your own psychology. When you face a crisis, you ask yourself, am I handling this using duality as conflict or duality as embrace? Are my logic and my emotions standing back to back, refusing to look at each other? Or can I set them side by side, acknowledge that both are fully valid trees, and have them hold hands to face the problem? It's about radical integration.
It removes the hierarchy. In the back-to-back model, usually one side secretly thinks it's superior. Rationality thinks it's better than intuition, or vice versa. Side-by-side means total equality.
Total equality and mutual respect. Bandel explicitly states that this resolves hierarchy. We don't have a king and a subordinate. We have a partnership, and this scales up from the internal psychology of a single person to interpersonal relationships and potentially to societal structures. It's an antidote to the zero-sum games that dominate our culture.
It requires a lot of maturity to stop fighting yourself. The drama of internal conflict can be addictive. We like the narrative of the hero battling the shadow. But Joe Bandel's Oak Matrix Anchor 8 asks us to outgrow that story, to recognize that the battle is over and the real work is walking forward together. If you found this breakdown of the Mirror Circle Kabbalah compelling, take a second to send this episode to a friend who loves exploring esoteric philosophy.